Hi, students. This video is an introduction to the next unit of our class, the last unit of our class, Unit 5, which is about the struggle to connect. And the main text we're using is M. Butterfly. So what we're thinking about or exploring in this unit is this whole idea of what is knowledge, what is truth, and how do we know what's real and when we found a real connection. Um, so we've been exploring knowledge and truth since our opening unit on the Enlightenment Project. But time and again, whether it be through Frankenstein or through M. Butterfly, we're seeing that sometimes scientific knowledge, the pursuit for truth, the pursuit of truth, don't always get us to the bottom of things. And that is sort of the central question of M. Butterfly. What is real? What is true? And what's an illusion? We touched on this a subject a few weeks ago when we looked at this painting, The Son of Man by Rene Magritte. And it's this strange painting. He painted this in 1964 with this sort of businessman with wearing a bowler cap with an apple covering up his face. And this is what Magritte says about this painting. At least it hides the face partly well. So you have the apparent face, the apple, hiding the visible but hidden, the face of the person. It's something that happens constantly. Everything we see hides another thing. We always want to see what is hidden by what we see. There is an interest in that which is hidden and which the visible does not show us. This interest can take the form of a quite intense feeling, a sort of conflict, one might say, between the visible that is hidden and the visible that is present. So this idea of there being invisible things or hidden things behind the visible things is sort of touched on in a few places in this course, and touches on a lot of ideas, particularly from the 20th century. So for example, if you've taken psychology and you've learned about Freud, the idea of the subconscious, the idea that sometimes we are acting in ways that we don't understand because we have subconscious forces acting on us. So, for example, a really classic example of that, a Freudian interpretation that talks about the influence of the hidden, or the idea that there is something hidden, is maybe the scenario. We know that a lot of domestic abuse happens in a cycle. So sometimes children who grow up in abusive homes grow up to be abusers or to marry abusers. And Freud might say that there's an unconscious need on the part of a survivor of domestic abuse to sort of work out those problems from childhood. So they keep picking abusive partners. We all know those cycles can be broken. One of the best ways to break those cycles is through education. But that's a good example of sort of the interaction between the visible and the hidden. That's another, a 20th century idea. And it's sort of what Magritte was playing with in his art. Another really great example of this idea of the surface not being the thing, or not encompassing everything that the thing is this very famous painting by Magritte from 1929. The Treachery of Images is what it's called. And this is what Magritte said about that. The famous pipe. Well, actually, I'm going to take a second. So, it's a painting of a pipe. And then underneath it in French, it says, "This is not a pipe." So those of you who took French in school know that. And this is what Magritte said about it. The famous pipe, how people reproached me for it. And yet, could you stuff my pipe? No, it's just a representation, is it not? So if I'd written on my picture, this is a pipe, I'd have been lying. So this is, you know, a sort of the ultimate expression of how the pictures of things are not the things themselves. And Magritte is sort of reminding us of that. And a lot of 20th century art reminded us of that. Okay. So as we consider this sort of idea that we're going to be talking about in M. Butterfly that we see in Magritte's art, you know, there's this kind of backlash or reaction to the idea that we can know things, that a picture of a pipe is the pipe, you know, that everything is as it appears. Remember that the Enlightenment was about the struggle for truth, progress, and the sharing of knowledge. And we'll be talking in this unit about a lot of ideas that challenge, you know, the ideas of the Enlightenment. But I also want you to keep in mind that, you know, there are many tremendous accomplishments of the Enlightenment and certainly of the scientific method, things like the invention of penicillin. Some would say, you know, the invention of democracy, or not the invention of democracy, but democracy, you know, finally being, you know, practiced in countries like the United States. So those are Enlightenment ideas and accomplishments of the Enlightenment project. But in subsequent centuries, a lot of other thinkers and a lot of other world events have caused us to say, but is it really that simple? Is everything that appears to be true or real really true or real? And one way Enlightenment thinking has been questioned has been that with the growing realization that Europe, or the West, of which we are part of, seems to have a major blind spot about the East. So when I say the East here, I'm talking about what is often called the Orient. We'll look at a map in the next slide. But basically, when we talk about the Orient, we're sort of talking about half the world, the half that isn't encompassed in the term the West. And many have pointed out in recent decades and centuries that the West, Europe and the United States, fixates on specific stereotypes of the East or the Orient, like the helpless Oriental woman, the dangerous but often not very effective man, and the exotic sensual setting where anything can happen. So when we talk about the Orient, we're going to be talking about Asia, but a lot of this also applies to what we traditionally call today the Middle East. So one of the facets of this blind spot is a sense of religious superiority, the idea that Christianity, you know, is the truth and should be spread far and wide. Often, and that it's somehow superior to religions of the East, such as Islam. Often people genuinely desire to help these very different other Oriental people, even if they didn't necessarily need help. So you may have heard stories about, you know, white colonialists coming to civilize certain countries. Those countries didn't need to be civilized. They had their own accomplishments, their own inventions and technology. And, you know, Westerners coming in did not always make things better. The ways that Westerners constantly get it wrong and misread the East or the Orient calls into question how successful thinkers like Diderot and Descartes were in their goal of achieving enlightened knowledge. So, as I said before, many positive things came out of the Enlightenment, but also, as we'll see in subsequent slides, some questionable ideas and some ideas that needed to be challenged. And a lot of those ideas were stereotyping. Where is the Orient anyway? And does the term the Middle East even make sense? Hard to say, but when we talk about the Orient, we're often referring to every place from North Africa through what we traditionally think of as Asia today, including India. So a big part of the world, and not it's impossible to glom together all the people in those parts of the world and say much about them that's true of all of them. It's a pretty diverse group of people living in a very large portion of the world. But this map shows you kind of the places that are often referred to as the Orient. All right, M. Butterfly. M. Butterfly is a play about seeing and believing and getting everything wrong. Gallimard's expectations and stereotypes of the Orient lead him to all the wrong conclusions. We just saw a map of what is referred to generally as the Orient. Orientalism is a theory put forth by Edward Said. And if you click on this link in this PowerPoint, or just look in our module for this week, you'll see a really great 4-minute video explaining the theory of Orientalism. But it's basically the idea that the way the West views the East is often inaccurate. It's often sort of self-serving and stereotyping. And there's often an overlay of the West assuming that the East needs to be civilized, needs the help of the West. And often there is a sense from the West that Western culture is inherently superior to the East. And Edward Said was the writer and thinker who first promoted that idea. And it had a huge effect on Western thought. So Madame M. Butterfly, if you took French, you know that actually the M stands for Monsieur. So it's like saying Mr. Butterfly. The very famous opera that title is a reference to is Madame Butterfly. And there's a really good short video synopsis of that opera, which you should probably check out while you're reading M. Butterfly. But one clue to where the play is going is the idea that David Henry Hwang, the playwright, did not call the play Madame Butterfly, but Monsieur Butterfly or Mr. Butterfly. So we just talked about how it's a play about seeing and believing and getting everything wrong. And it's based on this wild but true story. This is from the New York Times in May 11th, 1986. A former French diplomat and a Chinese opera singer have been sentenced to 6 years in jail for spying for China after a 2-day trial that traced a story of clandestine love and mistaken sexual identity. Mr. Borisco, who's Gallimard in the play, was accused of passing information to China after he fell in love with Mr. Xi, whom he believed for 20 years to be a woman. So Borisco, who's Gallimard in the play, is a French diplomat who has a lot of secrets. He was in he was in Asia. I believe he was in China. He fell in love with Mr. Xi, who was posing as a female opera singer, and they had a 20-year affair. And Mr. Xi was a man, but Mr. Borisco, Gallimard in the play, believes he is a woman, which just kind of makes your head explode. But that is a true story, and that is the true story that this play is based on. So David Henry Hwang, sort of through the character of Song, who plays the man posing as a woman, definitely implies that the reason that the diplomat could for so long not believe or not understand that his lover was a man was because he had so many stereotypes about Asian women. In the play, Song puts it this way: as soon as a Western man comes into contact with the East, he's already confused. The West has sort of an international rape mentality towards the East. Do you know rape mentality? Basically, her mouth says no, but her eyes say yes. The West thinks of itself as masculine, big guns, big industry, big money. So the East is feminine, weak, delicate, poor, but good at art and full of inscrutable wisdom, the feminine mystique. So Song in the play is kind of saying, you're so full of stereotypes about the East, you can't even see clearly. So this is sort of the first sort of challenge, or one of the challenges to the Enlightenment project in this play. The Enlightenment thinkers said, pursue knowledge, you've got to see it with your own eyes to see what's true. But in M. Butterfly, Song is saying, even when something's right in front of you, if you have a lot of preconceived ideas about that thing, you're not going to be able to see clearly. And Song sees that in the diplomat, and he exploits it. He takes advantage of it. I will just say one other thing about that is that, the diplomat himself says in the play, oh, I just thought she was being modest. She would never let me have the lights on when we were together sexually. And I just thought that's how Asian women were. So that's, again, how, these stereotypes of how Asian women are allows the diplomat to be tricked into revealing all these secrets that he knows as a member of the French government. And then we can say, is Song right? Let's think back to feudalism and the Crusades. In the Crusades, there was this idea that Christianity needed to be spread to uncivilized nations. So that seems to be a kind of stereotyping. During the Enlightenment search for truth, a lot of stereotypes about the Orient are reinforced. Sometimes this is because there is a belief that our way is better than their weird, different, other way. Remember that during the Enlightenment, there's still not a lot of travel to other places beyond Europe. And when there is, there's generally the perception that the West is the best, even when the opposite appears to be true in terms of science, math, navigational skills, agriculture, and pretty much anything else you can think of. So many of us who grew up in the United States, may have learned about a lot of great inventions and technology and science that was promulgated or discovered by European thinkers. But we know now of amazing inventions by non-Europeans, right? That the Enlightenment project thinkers definitely had a blind spot about the value of discoveries in other cultures. Remember too that a lot of the Enlightenment ideas of truth, progress, and knowledge are focused on national pride. So we talked in our section on the Enlightenment period, we talked a lot about how there was a growing sense of pride in being from, England or France. That's nationalism. America is best, or France is best. Those ideas were very prevalent during the Enlightenment period. M. Butterfly, the play depends on you knowing about these stereotypes so that the play can dismantle them. It's criticizing this Western Orientalist view of the East. And again, we looked at this picture by Boucher earlier in this semester. This idea of the helpless or Oriental woman is pretty well encapsulated there. Here's another painting by a Frenchman, the Snake Charmer from 1879. Think how different this painting is, from the painting of the valiant European men we saw in The Oath. I'm going to forget the name of that painting. The painting of the men taking the oath, where they're big and strong and powerful. In this picture, the view of these men in the Middle East, or maybe in Asia, they're sort of huddled on the ground. They don't seem to be doing much. They're sort of entranced by this snake charmer. The snake charmer himself is naked and vulnerable. These are not powerful images of masculinity, but this is an image from a European looking at people in the Orient. During the 19th and 20th centuries, this trend of having sort of stereotypes about the East continues. This was an age of colonization and war. Art, music, and culture helped to reinforce these stereotypes of what other cultures look like and what their strengths and weaknesses are. As the colonization of parts of Asia and the use of its resources continues, the stereotypes get worse. So the British East India Company was trading. I'm just gonna skip ahead to where I had some notes about this. Tea and opium, they had a monopoly on tea, and there were huge wars over who was going to be able to buy and sell opium. That was, England being in Asia, being in India, exploiting their resources and justifying their presence in India by saying, the helpless Indians need us to, have this trade, to civilize them, and they couldn't do it if we weren't here. So a lot of that exploitation through colonization that happened in the 19th, 20th centuries used negative stereotypes of people in the Orient to justify the exploitation. And there's a little hint, we also see this Orientalism and the stereotyping of non-European peoples in Frankenstein. I don't know if you guys remember the story of Safie. She's the fiancée of Edgar de Lacy, and she's Turkish. And her father had wanted her to marry a Turkish man and be part of a harem, but she escapes, and she's sort of seen as virtuous because she escapes her sort of, the cage of being Turkish, and seems to prefer to marry a European Christian. So the idea that her father, who is Turkish, is sort of nefarious and dishonest and controlling, is a pretty stereotypical idea of a non-European man. And the idea that she is sort of more virtuous because she wants to escape from that and marry a Christian, that's a very stereotypical way that the West looks at people from the East. So right in the middle of Frankenstein, even from a woman as well-educated as Mary Shelley, we see that kind of stereotyping. Two operas that sort of perpetuated the idea of Oriental women as sort of helpless are The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan, which is sort of about these helpless Japanese schoolgirls getting married off, and Madame Butterfly by Puccini, which you can read a synopsis of in this week's module. And we might see less, I don't know, detrimental stereotyping going on in Aladdin and Arabian Nights. You know, often even in a Disney film, there's some kind of, you know, stereotyping of the Orient as a magical but sort of nonsensical place, and the women there as more exotic maybe than women in Europe. And another, you know, huge example in American history of Orientalism is what was called the Yellow Peril, which was fear of Asian immigrants. A lot of Chinese people were coming into the United States in the late 19th century, early 20th century. A lot of Chinese Americans basically built the railroads in the United States. And of course, they came in and were employed quickly because they would accept low wages. And there was throughout American culture at that time, there were many expressions of a fear of Chinese Americans and Asians in general. A lot of stuff written about they might take our jobs, they might take our women, they might be unsafe. You might think about what parallels there are today in contemporary American culture. And of course, this reached a really terrible, you know, expression of this. The expression of this yellow peril, one terrible expression of it in our culture was the internment of Japanese Americans in camps during World War II. Many of those people in camps were American citizens, but simply because they were of Asian descent, they were deemed suspicious, and they had all their property taken away, and were put in these camps. And I cannot recommend strongly enough the Japanese American Museum in Little Tokyo. It's a wonderful museum. You can take the metro right there. And you can walk through it in an hour or two. And it really describes the yellow peril and the damage as a result of it that followed. Other expressions of sort of this of Orientalism in the 20th century later on in like the 80s was the song and video of China Girl by David Bowie, this idea of escaping with an exotic Chinese woman. Very classic stereotyping. And in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, there's very much an idea that these Orientals that Indiana Jones is fighting, that they're sort of silly and ineffective. I think of that moment in that movie where there's some kind of fight going on and some Middle Eastern man comes out with his sword and he's waving it and doing all these fancy moves with it. And Indiana Jones pulls out his gun and just shoots him. And it's supposed to be funny. But the joke is, of course, that, you know, these people from the East don't have the technology and the war technology that we have. They're so backward, which of course is not accurate. But that's often the joke in movies which stereotype people from the East. I'm sure you can think of other stereotypes of the Orient or Oriental people. And like I said before, we are talking about a huge swath of land with many different cultures within it. But in terms of thinking, we see everywhere in our culture this sort of division of the West and the East. And, you know, one of the things Madame Butterfly is about is, excuse me, M. Butterfly is about, is how these stereotypes that the West has about the East can blind us to what is real and authentic. In recent years, many works of art and books and other efforts have focused on challenging these stereotypes. There was a musical by Stephen Sondheim, Pacific Overtures, that challenged these stereotypes, and Butterfly, which we're reading. And you could even think about Hello Peril in the movie Always Be My Maybe, which of course is a riff on Yellow Peril. All of those are making fun of or calling into question the way the West looks at the East and asking Westerners to look more deeply. The play makes us question all of the truths we've become complacent about believing. If everything we see hides another thing, which is what Magritte said, and what we believe about others may hide the truth of their experience, can we really be certain about the truth, progress, and enlightenment ideals? How does that fit into the search for truth that we're all doing as individuals? And I think I'm going to end it there. Those are just some things to think about as you start in reading the play. Like I said, I think it takes about 3 hours to read. It's an interesting little story, even more so, I think, when you realize it's based on a true story. And I think David Henry Hwang sort of takes sort of an interesting approach to imagining how this might have happened. So I hope you enjoy the play. Let me know if you have any questions.